Hermit and Pig is the debut title from two-man studio Heavy Lunch, and features a pair of what I don't think it's unfair to describe as unlikely heroes. Video games are, certainly more than any other medium in my opinion, quite good at getting their audiences to just go along with unusual protagonists, but I still have to admit that my initial reaction to these two was a sort of, wait, really? As opposed to any level of excitement at the prospect of putting myself into this guy's presumably pretty nasty shoes. Still, there was something endearing about him, which I couldn't quite place. Maybe initially it was just his cute best friend, but after a little while with this hermit, he's arguably become one of my favourite characters from any release over the last year or two. So, stick around and I will tell you why. In Hermit and Pig, you play as the eponymous hermit. That's as much of a name as you really need, as you, by definition, don't really interact with anyone else. The exception to that being the also eponymously named Pig, your trusty, truffle-sniffing sidekick. Of course, that means your day-to-day conversations are pretty one-sided, oinks notwithstanding. I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say that Hermit is quickly thrown out of his very small comfort zone, being reluctantly forced into an awful lot of interactions over the course of one incredibly busy day. Not all of those interactions are friendly, but whether he's brawling or attempting to have a chat, it's all pretty stressful for our elderly protagonist. If anything, he seems slightly more comfortable getting into a scrap than into a conversation. When it comes to fighting, it's fists, or cane, or slingshot up, off we go. But if there's somebody nearby who might want to talk to Hermit, the beads of sweat start flying off him. Literally, I mean, look at this little guy. You probably already know how a turn-based RPG works, so I won't bog you down with too many details, but there are a couple of peculiarities here when it comes to the combat. Firstly, Hermit's 6 attacks are performed by inputting 3 key combinations of up, down, left or right, which are mapped to W, A, S and D on keyboards. I really quite like the configuration of those, as there's typically a physical association you can make. To kick, it's a sweep of the 3 bottom buttons from left to right. To stomp, it's an up followed by 2 downs, as if you're raising Hermit's foot and crashing it back down. To punch, you pull back with a couple of lefts and swing forward with a right. That sort of thing. I think you can feel a little overwhelmed by that at first. There's 6 moves to learn, and initially you might not really make those associations, particularly on account of the second part of the combat that I would like to draw attention to. That turns are timed. There is a timer that is constantly ticking down in the top right corner. If you don't get your actions in time, then that's your turn wasted. Perhaps a little cruelly, that keeps going even when you're looking in the manual to try and initially learn those attacks. So in that rush, it's quite easy to miss that there is a little more logic to those combos than you might first realise. At least, that's the way the game works as presented in the tutorial, and I have to admit I had some difficulty with that. Sometimes I go into a game wanting a challenge, but it felt slightly at odds with the experience I was expecting from Hermit and Pig. For me, I was hoping for something that I could unwind with, not necessarily something where I needed to remember a bunch of combo moves and input them within a relatively brief window. Luckily for me, then, Heavy Lunch have created a game that is incredibly accommodating for its players, with ample options that allow them to change up the rules of combat and play on their own terms. If you don't want to have a turn timer, you can turn it off. If you don't want to input codes, you can give yourself a drop down for your attacks instead. Hell, if you really want to, you can have Hermit automatically choose the best attack available. If you'd like the timer to pause while you're in those menus, there's even an option for that. On top of all that, there's also difficulty settings available, and while it's probably pretty clear from what I've said so far that I didn't try this, there's certainly a combination of options there that I think could make this game very challenging indeed. For me though, I was playing on what could fairly be described as easy mode, a sort of 2 out of 5 in terms of available difficulty settings, but I arguably should have given the default options a bit more of an attempt. I turned off both combo inputs and turn timers pretty much as soon as the opportunity was presented to me, and never really looked back. But there were some fights, particularly in the mid-game, which I suspect I'd have enjoyed a little more with one or both of those options still in play. I felt those combats dragged on just a bit too much, and I don't know whether that would have been the case with some added challenge. Even if those fights would have actually ended up taking longer, I'd have been juggling more things, rather than just going through the motions of grinding down my enemy's health. Outside of the combats, you've also got the conversations, which are presented in a similar cutaway style. Each time Hermit needs to speak, you've got 3 options to pick from, many of which portray his status as a bumbling, socially awkward introvert who's just trying his best to avoid stumbling over his words or blurting out the first thought that comes to his mind. If he says something inappropriate, his conversation partner will cringe and he will take a single point of damage. Gameplay purists might not appreciate this, but I couldn't help but often pick those bad options, knowing full well that, mechanically, it wasn't doing anything other than ticking my hit points down. I was honestly thrilled about an hour into the game when I found a trinket. This game's equipable items that give you small boosts, which gave me bonus experience for making people cringe, as I'd been happily doing that for free up until that point anyway. That does bring me on to the humour in Hermit and Pig. I think it's fair to say that comedy is probably the most subjective area of writing, but for me, this is the funniest game I've played in a long time. Perhaps that's because I can a little too readily relate to the Hermit and his struggles with, regular human conversation, and if I know my audience, perhaps you would be able to too. And while I don't want to talk up a game by talking down others, I do often struggle with games that are trying what feels like too hard to be funny. Nothing ruins a game faster for me than frequent jokes that just don't land. Thankfully, that's not the case here, and while the humour was definitely a big factor in why I enjoyed Hermit and Pig so much, it's only one part of the charm that this game exudes. I'll give you another roundabout example of that. I made a throwaway gag in last week's review of Space Warlord Baby Trading Simulator, which meant for the video version, I wanted some random footage from any game at all of a sea cucumber. That joke wasn't quite as infantile as you might think. Either way, I half-checked if there were any in Subnautica, and when I couldn't find one there, I pretty much gave up. I mean, if there wasn't one in that game, where would there be one? Cut to the day after I'd sent that review to the presses, and lo and behold, what villain should this peculiar hermit I'm playing as be confronted with, other than what appeared to be a sea cucumber? I mean, full disclosure, I later learned that it's actually supposed to be a leech, but Hermit and Pig is so delightfully off the wall that it seemed perfectly reasonable to me that there would be a sea cucumber there. There's an unbridled creativity here that you don't often see. I can't imagine there were many conversations between the game's 2-man development team where one of them would say, "Nope, that's too mad, too weird, we're not putting it in." That isn't to say that it's nonsensical, and despite the game's unlikely and unassuming heroes, there are a couple of overarching messages in Hermit and Pig that do feel meaningful, and elevate the game beyond what would otherwise be a fun little RPG that you'd enjoy, but more or less forget about a few days after finishing. Could those messages be more subtle? Probably, but neither Hermit nor Pig really do subtle. I think I'll leave it to you to discover exactly what those messages are. Just knowing that he's a hermit can probably help guide you towards at least one of them, and let it be known that I am not including "don't forage unless you know what you're doing," even if that's arguably the most important takeaway. I want to be clear, as do the creators of this game, that you shouldn't do that. What you should know is that there is a lot of heart here. I had a fantastic time with Hermit and Pig. I'm probably getting a little ahead of myself, and usually I'm an advocate for developers trying something new each time they release a game, rather than relying on sequels, but I would love nothing more than another game, or 2 or 20, about this unconventional duo. Either way, I'm excited to see what Heavy Lunch do next, after a very strong debut. Hermit and Pig is awarded 8 out of 10 by IndieLoupe.